There is a country that has not fired a single missile in this war, has not lost a single soldier, has not spent a single dollar on air defense, and right now it is winning. Hold on to that idea, because it is about to reframe everything you think you know about who is actually benefiting from the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And before we go further, let's be precise. There are no clean winners in any war. But if we are going to talk about who gains, and we have to, because the word victory is being thrown around by every government involved, then we need to look past the battlefield. We need to look at who is watching, who is learning, and who is already planning what comes next. Because while Washington and Tel Aviv are counting the cost of this war, Beijing is counting the dividends. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell, because what you are about to hear is not in any official briefing. Let's get into it. Go back to February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched what military planners call a decapitation strike against Iran. The objective was to eliminate Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, shatter the command structure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and trigger a power vacuum so catastrophic that the Islamic Republic would simply collapse from within. Part of that plan technically worked. Khamenei was killed. Several senior commanders died alongside him. The opening salvo struck more than 2,500 targets in the first week alone. And then everything went wrong. But before we move on, something must be said plainly. Reports from UN officials, the Washington Post, and multiple international outlets documented civilian casualties, including children. The UN Security Council condemned the strikes. The UN General Assembly condemned them. And the question that no one in power seems willing to answer is this. With satellite imagery, GPS precision targeting, and the most sophisticated military hardware on Earth, how do residential buildings end up mistaken for military installations? The absence of any accountability tells you everything about how international law functions when the most powerful nations decide to sidestep it. Now back to why the strategy collapsed. The assumption at the core of the operation was simple. Remove the supreme leader, and the system falls apart. It was a model built on wishful intelligence. What the CIA and Mossad apparently failed to account for was the succession, and specifically, who the successor would be. Iran's assembly of experts moved immediately. Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was appointed as the new supreme leader. The IRGC pledged loyalty without hesitation. The government did not fracture, it consolidated. And here is what Washington did not anticipate. Mujtaba is younger than his father, more hard-line than his father. He has deep ties with the Revolutionary Guard going back decades. And on the first day of this war, he lost his father and several family members in a single strike. Think about that for a moment. Every morning, when the new supreme leader opens his eyes, the first thought is not negotiation. It is not compromise. It is personal. The CIA and Mossad did not just fail to prevent the succession. They handed power to someone younger, more motivated, more ideologically hardened, and with a personal score to settle that no diplomatic framework can neutralize. That is not a tactical setback. That is a strategic catastrophe. Subscribe if you are not already. This is exactly the kind of analysis that never appears in official briefings. Now let's talk about the country that has been watching all of this very, very carefully. China is not bleeding in this war. China is studying it. Every vulnerability exposed in U.S. carrier groups, every gap in air defense networks, every drone that got through, every F-35 that made an emergency landing. Beijing has been logging it all. And while the United States burns through an estimated $1.88 billion per day, while Europe convulses over gas prices, while Gulf states absorb strikes on their airports and infrastructure for the first time in history, China is manufacturing, stockpiling, and learning. Let's talk about what China is actually learning. The United States built its military doctrine on projection of force. What this war is demonstrating, piece by piece, is that projecting force against a determined adversary on its own territory, using asymmetric tactics specifically designed to exhaust the defender, is far more costly and far less decisive than the doctrine assumed. The math is brutal. Iranian drones cost approximately $20,000 each. American interceptors cost between $1 and $2 million per unit. Iran has been launching them in saturation waves. The United States has been shooting them down. Every single intercept is a transaction that favors Iran's balance sheet, not America's. China's military doctrine is built around exactly this logic: saturation and mass. If U.S. interceptor stockpiles can be depleted at this rate in Iran, the calculus for any Taiwan contingency changes fundamentally. China does not need to win a direct engagement. It needs the United States to be exhausted, distracted, and financially overextended before any confrontation begins. This war is giving Beijing a live rehearsal of that scenario, at zero cost to China. Now let's look at the economic dimension, because it is not being discussed seriously enough. Iran has struck energy infrastructure across 9 countries. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves, has been effectively closed. Brent crude is trading near $100 a barrel. European natural gas prices nearly doubled after Iranian drones struck Qatari gas facilities on March 2nd, forcing Qatar Energy to halt all gas production. The Netherlands TTF gas benchmark climbed above €60 per megawatt hour. European gas storage, already at historically low levels after a harsh winter, has been pushed to the edge. South Korea, according to CSIS, has been hit harder than any non-combatant country in the world by this conflict, facing simultaneous economic and political pressure from disrupted energy and shipping chains. The total financial burden, as the Pentagon confirmed to Congress, exceeds $200 billion in projected costs. Who benefits from all of this? China imports less Middle Eastern oil than the Western narrative suggests. China has spent years building alternative energy supply chains precisely to reduce exposure to Hormuz. And as energy costs crush European industry and strain American consumers, Chinese manufacturing, operating on cheaper domestic energy and longer-term supply contracts, becomes relatively more competitive with every passing week. While the United States bleeds dollars and credibility, China accumulates both. And there is a longer game being played here that almost nobody in Western media wants to discuss openly. If Iran survives this war, and at this moment, survival appears more likely than collapse, China moves immediately to rebuild it. Not gradually, not cautiously, immediately. Infrastructure contracts, energy agreements, port development. The Belt and Road framework already has Iran positioned as a node. A post-war Iran that survived American and Israeli air power will be far more willing to deepen that relationship and far less interested in any Western-aligned future. Russia is already active in this dynamic. U.S. and Israeli officials confirmed to the Associated Press in early March that Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence to help strike American military assets. The anti-Western coalition is not theoretical, it is operational. China is letting Russia absorb the reputational cost of that involvement, while positioning itself as the indispensable partner for Iran's reconstruction. That is not improvisation. That is a strategic posture years in the making, now being activated by a war China did not start and does not need to fight. 13 or more U.S. military bases have been degraded or forced offline since the conflict began. Coalition coherence is fraying. Israel and Washington are openly diverging on timeline and objectives. Netanyahu's office acknowledged Trump's diplomatic efforts, but did not indicate support for them. That is not an alliance at full coherence. That is two governments pulling in incompatible directions, while the region absorbs the cost. The pressure to end this war is not symmetrical. It falls overwhelmingly on the side with elections in 7 months, on the side with crude at $100 and climbing, on the side with a public that never clearly supported this war, on the side spending nearly $2 billion a day to intercept drones that cost $20,000 each. Iran's strategic logic is simple. Survival is victory. The new supreme leader does not need to defeat the United States militarily. He needs to outlast Washington's political will. And every indicator right now suggests that the will is weakening faster than the military situation justifies. Two scenarios are emerging for how this ends. The first is what analysts are calling a simulated victory. Trump announces that the United States has successfully degraded Iran's nuclear program and that primary objectives have been achieved. Israel makes parallel declarations. Iran simultaneously declares that it survived a full military assault from two of the world's most powerful armed forces, which is simply true, and presents that survival as a historic triumph. Something gets signed. Something that looks broadly similar to what was being negotiated before the war started. Both sides sell their domestic audiences a version of events that allows everyone to claim they won. This has happened before. The June 2025 ceasefire was almost exactly this structure. Iranian President Pezeshkian called it a great victory on state television. Netanyahu called it a historic victory for Israel. Trump claimed success. Everyone went home claiming to have won. The question is whether that template still holds in a conflict that is structurally larger, longer, and far more personally irresolvable for the new Iranian leadership. The second scenario is darker. If Trump concludes that Netanyahu is pulling the United States deeper into a war that is destroying his midterm prospects and creating energy conditions no amount of messaging can fix, he pulls back. America reduces its direct involvement. Israel is left fighting alone. A country of 9 million against a nation of 90 million without American air support, against an adversary that has already demonstrated it can strike energy infrastructure across 6 Gulf countries and absorb the most intensive opening air campaign in American military history. Under that scenario, you get prolonged attrition. A government in Tehran governing over a damaged country under permanent pressure, but surviving. And under Iran's strategic logic, that outcome counts as a win. But neither of those scenarios changes what China walks away with. In scenario 1, China gets a weakened United States that spent $200 billion and exhausted critical weapon stockpiles, achieving approximately what diplomacy might have achieved before the first strike. China gets a detailed study of American military limitations under sustained asymmetric pressure. And China gets a front-row seat to what happens when the most powerful military on Earth tries to force regime change and fails. In scenario 2, China gets all of that, plus a collapsed U.S. Gulf alliance structure, an Iran that survived and is primed for deep partnership, and a demonstration to every regional power on Earth that American security guarantees have limits. Beijing does not have a preferred outcome in this war. It has a preferred aftermath, and that aftermath looks the same regardless of how the fighting ends. The United States built a post-Cold War order on the assumption that no adversary could absorb this kind of military pressure and survive. Iran is in the process of disproving that assumption in real time. And China is taking notes on every page. So when the dust settles, when the final statements are issued, when every government declares its version of victory, when the cables and briefings are eventually declassified, ask yourself one question. Who is building ports in post-war Iran? Who is selling turbines to energy-starved Europe? Who emerges from this war with stronger alliances, fuller stockpiles, a sharper understanding of American military limitations, and a cleaner balance sheet? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the most consequential strategic question of this moment. And the answer was never on the battlefield. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening, not the version being packaged for you, but the real strategic picture. Leave your answer in the comments. Is China the biggest winner of this war, or is there a player we are all still underestimating? See you in the next one.